introductory lecture, but everything that happened in the theater itself on the Theater J website. And if you all didn't go, it's a great opportunity. And I guess my favorite question is whether or not they did a robust enough job in talking about Spinoza as a Jew. But we talked about that a little bit last year, and I'm sure we'll return to it at some point, but you should decide that for yourself. I think the final tally was 78% to 22% voted to revoke the cherem. So, and that may sound like a large number, but the pre-Spinozian voting was 90 to 10 for Spinoza. So the lawyer against Spinoza actually did better. Fair enough. Fair enough. From my standpoint, it's against. From my standpoint, it's against. No, the lawyer who did better was the one. I hear you. It was the one who said that Spinoza was not a Jew or he should be excommunicated. Go ahead. We're killing time, so go ahead. Well, I guess it depends on whether they looked at that as an exercise of what should the community at the time have done, or what would we today do? And one of the judges made it very clear we're supposed to be voting based on what we today would do. Hopefully the jury listened to the instruction of the judges, which is not always what happens. But as an attorney, it would offend me if they didn't. Because I think if the question was should they have excommunicated him at the time, most of us would probably say they had no choice. Spinoza might have said they had no choice. All right.
Some people would say there's always choice.
And some people, Spinoza said there wasn't.
Freedom, but no choice. Okay. All right. Well, unless there's any objections, I think I'm going to start. And I'll probably just go through this and take Q&A later, because this is a long one. And my topic tonight is profiles in panentheism. I'm going to compare the philosophies of two panentheists, Spinoza and Arthur Green. Let me introduce it this way. We'll call this daring to break the monopoly. You can consider this talk part of a larger effort to break a monopoly. Now, I know a little bit about antitrust law, but the monopoly I have in mind isn't one that an antitrust lawyer would concern himself with. It's much more insidious. For this is an unseen monopoly, not a business, but an idea. It's the notion that the word God refers to one thing and one thing only. A supernatural, omnipotent, omnibenevolent deity that is altogether separate from the world he created in accordance with his perfect will. And that is the perspective on God that we continue to associate primarily with each of the Abrahamic faiths, especially in their more orthodox schools. It's also the source of the widespread popularity of modern atheism and agnosticism. And when I say agnosticism, I mean self-professed agnosticism. All philosophers are agnostic, but I'm talking about self-professed agnosticism. If you scratch the surface of these heresies, you will find, I believe, that when people choose to avoid a belief in God, what they are truly avoiding, and in some cases defiantly rejecting, is a belief in the traditional conception of divinity. The atheists and agnostics generally accept the traditional definition of God, and as a result, they have ceded the domain of religion to the monopolists. I am obviously not willing to make that concession, and nor are either of these two thinkers that we will discuss tonight. They both ground their philosophy on the one that they call God, and yet they are clearly attempting to redefine the word. In that sense, they are engaging in what progressive clerics have come to mean by reclaiming the divine. In other words, while they recognize that they cannot accept the traditional notion of divinity, they are unwilling to reject the idea of God altogether. Others are doing the same thing, albeit with different redefinitions. But I have selected these two thinkers because I think that the future of progressive religion will largely involve a confrontation between these two perspectives on God. And I say that notwithstanding the profound similarities between them. So the next part of my talk will be called Spinoza and Green, Two Panentheists with a Common Set of Core Ideas. Now, the Washington Spinoza Society hardly needs a biography of the first of these two thinkers, Baruch Spinoza. But our members may know little about the second, Rabbi Arthur Green. Rabbi Green is one of the preeminent Jewish theologians alive today. I don't think there's any real debate about that. While at the Jewish Theological Seminary, he studied under the great Abraham Joshua Heschel. Later, he became dean of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where my daughter goes, the only rabbinical school in the Reconstructionist movement. And then after leaving RRC, he founded a non-denominational rabbinical school called Hebrew College, which is up in Boston. Rabbi Green is also arguably the leading contemporary exponent of the Jewish school of thought known as Neo-Hasidism. But perhaps most importantly, when he speaks in public, he doesn't come across as a big macha, big shot. He's a plain-spoken man who happens to love mystical pursuits, reasoned discourse, modern ideas, and progressive social action. In short, he is a philosopher's kind of theologian. But Green is, first and foremost, a theologian, and Spinoza is a philosopher. And therein lies not only the source of differences in the language they use and the materials they cite or don't cite, but also in the content of their teachings. And that is especially fascinating because those teachings rest on a common foundation known as panentheism. Literally, this word denotes that the all is in God. And it can be contrasted to the more commonly used term pantheism, which means simply that the all is, or means the same thing as, God. You will see there's a difference. Or if you prefer, panentheism is a branch of pantheism. In his book, Radical Judaism, Green explicitly adopts the mantle of a panentheist. And I quote, "My theological position is that of a mystical panentheist, one who believes that God is present throughout all of existence, that being, or Adonai, underlies and unifies all that is. At the same time, and this is panentheism as distinct from pantheism, this whole is mysteriously and infinitely greater than the sum of its parts, and cannot be fully known or reduced to its constituent beings," unquote. In another extensive statement of Green's theology, "Seek My Face," he points to the Shema, Judaism's central prayer, to illustrate his panentheism. After referring to the first line of the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, Adonai our God, Adonai is one," he refers to that as the higher unity, the inner gate of oneness. And then Green says the following, and I quote, "According to the unity of the Shema, all is one as though there were no many. Nothing but the one exists. Infinity goes on throughout our world, or through our world, with all its variety and beauty, with all its suffering and crises, makes not the slightest bit of difference. The garbing of divine energy in the countless forms of existence is naught when seen from the point of view of infinity. Only infinity is real here, God of endless cosmic space-time. On the sheet of paper I gave you, this would be God on the left side of the page, if you will. In other words, Green says, taken from the perspective of the, quote, inner gate of oneness, God represents complete transcendent unity, or if you prefer, the unity of nothingness, because it does not refer to any one thing or even a collection of things. From this standpoint, God is more verb than noun, and the divine name can best be translated as, and I'm quoting from Green, was, is, will be, for it, quote, contains all of time in eternal presence, unquote. Now, let's get to what Green refers to as God's outer gate. The right side of the page, right? He presents this idea through the second and final sentence of the Shema. Quote, well, here's the second and final sentence. Blessed is the name of God's glorious kingdom forever and ever. This, Green says, is the lower unity, the one within the many. We refer to it as the unity of God's kingdom. Here we encounter God's oneness in and through the world, not despite it. Each flower, each blade of grass, each human soul is a new manifestation of divinity, a new unfolding of the cosmic one that ever reveals itself through multicolored garments, in each moment taking on new and ever-changing forms of life. Existence here is celebrated in variety, in specificity, rather than in the vast sameness. This God, too, represents infinity, but the infinity of one in many. That's a hyphenated word he uses, one in many. The whole earth is filled with God's glory, unquote. The outer gate, then, is the same God as the inner gate. But this time the divine is viewed not as a single unity, but rather as a complex, interconnected web of worldly beings. And Green states that these two perspectives, quote, stand in dialectical relations to one another. They represent the same finely wrought transparent vessel, here seen in emptiness, here in fullness. And then he says, our religious task is to see through to the oneness of these two truths, to recognize that the one beyond and the one within are the same one. Now, clearly Green sees his theology, or I should say his philosophy, as being outside of the mainstream of Jewish tradition. Why else would he have entitled one of his books, Radical Judaism? Yet Green locates the roots of his panentheist teachings in the views of the early Hasidic sages of the 18th century. The phrases, the whole earth is filled with his glory, there is no place devoid of him, are core Hasidic teachings. Even today, Orthodox Hasids commonly adopt panentheism, refusing to buy into the traditional wall of separation between the so-called creator and the creation. But Green's heresy, as a philosopher, goes well beyond that. Again, I read from Green, quote, the faith in a transcendent and personal God, that is a God conceived in personalist terms, no longer satisfies our religious needs. The parental, royal, and pastoral metaphors we have inherited are not adequate for describing the relationship between God and the world as we experience and understand it. Providence is not the center of our faith. The terrible course of Jewish history in our century has made this conventional Western religious viewpoint impossible, even blasphemous for us. If there is a God of history, an independent, all-powerful being who shapes the historic process, such a God's indifference to human and Jewish suffering might lead us to cynicism or despair, but not to worship, unquote. As you can see, this respected neo-Hasid has taken a fateful step away from the teachings of the traditional Hasidic communities. Green styles himself as a modern, even postmodernist thinker who has adopted a Judaism that dares to take into account both the teachings of modern science and the stubborn fact of history, including the profound truths of the Holocaust. Talks a lot about it. Gone, as you might suspect, is the notion that all events flow from God's mercy and justice. In fact, it would be difficult to reconcile what Green has said about the inner gate of the divine with positing any human-like qualities as part of God's essence. For example, Green's philosophy even limits God's free will. He asks, if God is able to choose whether to create or not to create, or if God is better viewed as possessing a nature that, quote, requires a flowing forth of the stream of life, unquote. Green's answer is indeed the invocation of necessity, the path, in other words, of Spinoza. You wondered if I'd get to him. Those of you who have been steeped in Spinoza, but not Green, must be wondering at this point whether Green decided to lift Spinoza's entire philosophy. Why even talk about Spinoza? I can just talk about Green, right? By the end of this talk, you will see just how far from the truth that is. For now, let it suffice to point out a superficial difference between these two thinkers. Spinoza never adopted the term panentheism, as it had not come into our lexicon until well after his death. And even today, Spinoza's scholars debate whether he was really a panentheist or whether he was instead a simple pantheist whose God in no meaningful respects transcends the world. With the rise of the atheist/humanist movement, we can see Spinoza's panentheism questioned on a regular basis. Adherents of that movement realize how much they can benefit from adopting the great heretical thinkers from bygone eras, and Spinoza is about as heretical as they come. His name is almost a synonym of heretic. He did, after all, famously use the phrase God or nature, suggesting to some that his God is nature, nothing more, nothing less. To the humanist, the difference between Spinoza's pantheism and their own humanism is merely a semantic one. They would argue that while Spinoza uses the term God and they use the term nature, neither believes that anything transcends nature. And in that sense, they think, both are truly atheists, at least in the way the rest of the world defines God. And that would explain why Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion refers to the pantheism of Spinoza and his disciple Einstein as, quote, sexed up atheism. Personally, I subscribe to a school of thought that views Spinoza to be every bit as panentheistic as Green. In other words, I see Spinoza as neither an atheist nor as a simple pantheist. It is true that Spinoza referred to God as nature, but he also referred to God as substance. And substance, in Spinoza's lexicon, represents the ground of being or existence. It is a perspective on God that can be contrasted to what we mean by nature. The sum of all the animals, vegetables, minerals, and particles, in other words, what we mean by natural forms, or for that matter, the sum of all our thoughts. For Spinoza, these things and these thoughts are all examples of the infinite ways in which substance expresses itself. We human beings are thus mere expressions of God as substance, and substance underlies, right? Substance underlies who and what we are. Spinoza sees substance as necessarily infinite, indivisible, and eternal. It is simple creative energy or power which unifies all that has existed, exists, or will exist. To use Spinoza's words, quote, "The eternal does not admit of when or before or after. And every worldly form exists just as it must, because it is grounded in the creative nature of the divine substance." Well, the sheet that I gave you has, two sides of the page. On the left side, we see what Spinoza would call natura naturans, which literally means nature naturing. And it refers to God insofar as God is substance, the creative ground of being. And Spinoza uses the term natura naturata, which literally means nature natured, the right side of the page, to refer to God's expressions, which include nature as we know it and all the mental conceptions that accompany physical forms. So there you have it, two perspectives on the same God, as active and as passive. Spinoza sees the ground of being, or substance, as God insofar as God is active. And he sees the world as we know it, animals, vegetables, minerals, thoughts, as God insofar as God is passive, or understood through the expressions of the divine power. Substance, Spinoza thought, expresses itself based on its own creative nature, naturally. As for notions like intellect, will, desire, and love, and those words are in quotes, Spinoza tells us that they apply only to God as passive nature, or naturata, and not to substance itself. Remember, substance is indivisible. In other words, for Spinoza, the world of our perceptions is like an infinite array of photographs or snapshots. That's what's on the right side of the page. That's nature natured. That's why it's in the past tense. The real source of the action is this unified substance. And it's beyond our ability to perceive, right? Though we can infer its existence, he says, through logical reasoning. Before I continue discussing Spinoza's panentheism, let me note that Green did not explicitly adopt all of Spinoza's doctrines, but time and time again you will hear echoes of Spinoza's metaphysics in Green's writings, which postdate Spinoza's death by 3 centuries. In the notion of substance, or natura naturans, you thus may have what I would call the transcendent element in Spinoza's philosophy. And this element is clearly at the heart of Spinoza's God. You can't have his God without the left side of that page. His substance is literally the indivisible, timeless, creative force, uniquely infinite in all respects, which underlies and powers every discrete thing that shall ever exist in any dimension of reality. And atheists, to my knowledge, do not hold to the belief in such a power, and in fact, I would argue that it takes some sort of leap of faith to do so, despite all of Spinoza's attempts to prove its existence with the logical precision of a mathematician. Without taking that leap, we may well view reality as a realm of universal multiplicity, tied together by common properties, perhaps, but ultimately existing purely as a collection of separate forms without anything that truly glues them together. And further drumming in the notion that Spinoza's God is more than just the sum of earthly forms, Spinoza taught that God has infinite attributes, of which we know merely two: extension and thought. To Spinoza, the world as we know it, the world of matter and mind, is but a tiny domain when compared to the totality of the infinite God. And of course, one could argue that those dimensions of existence which give rise to other hidden attributes are really part of the same nature in which we all knowingly partake. But the common parlance would be to acknowledge that those dimensions transcend our perceptive powers. Thus, once you start recognizing in God not only dimensions of reality that transcend our perceptive realm, but also a unifying power that transcends multiplicity itself, you have posited an altogether different reality than that which is recognized by the scientistic mind. In short, Spinoza and Green both appreciate that a panentheistic God may be conceived through two perspectives: as the unique, indivisible, creative ground of being, and as the sum of all expressions of that creative ground, whether we're able to perceive them like mind and body, or whether we're not, like an infinite number of other domains. To these panentheists, God is the dialectical synthesis of these two perspectives: the hidden one and the all-in-one, conceived as the highest unity of them all, the one and only. Again, semantically, one person could refer to that synthesis simply as nature, just as another person could make up another name for it, like the absolute synthesis. But whenever you join Green and Spinoza and invoke a venerated, emotionally laden name for the absolute synthesis, the name of God, and whenever you teach that this God should be the object of the greatest love of all, not only have you laid the groundwork for stripping God of all human-like qualities, but you have also clearly removed yourself from the realm of atheism, sexed up or otherwise. And this could explain why Spinoza, at the end of his Ethics, at the very end, referred to the intellectual love of God as the state of blessedness. It is a religious word befitting an affirmatively religious ethics. Well, they're getting along now, aren't they? Let's change that. As a novelist, I can't stand this much harmony. The next part of my talk is called The Divergence. Panentheism, the philosophy, versus panentheism, the theology. Otherwise known as The Plot is About to Thicken. Spinoza was a Jew and a Torah scholar. Yet he based his conclusions about God on rigorous logical reasoning, rather than the teachings of Scripture or later Jewish theology. The result is that we associate him today with Western philosophy and not the religion of Judaism. In Rabbi Green, we have an example of a Jewish theologian whose core philosophy was set forth in Spinoza's Ethics in far greater depth and clarity than it had ever appeared in any other Jewish writing, before or since. But did Green, in the fundamental statements of his theology, ever credit Spinoza for anticipating or grounding his own philosophy? You know the answer to that, right? It's either of course not or hell no, or there's a different word than hell that I would have used back in college beginning with the letter F. No. The only time Green references Spinoza, either in Radical Judaism or Seek My Face, was to blast the way Spinoza interpreted the Torah. For example, and this is, by the way, a time-honored tradition of people who are, saying the same thing Spinoza did, but then blast him, and only blast him. For example, Green says that, quote, "We stand in open conflict with Spinoza's insistence that the Bible must be treated just like any other document, its words meaning what critical scrutiny seem to indicate and nothing more," unquote. With that statement, Green indicated that for all of his self-proclaimed radicalism, he was indeed speaking to us as a text-based religious Jew, as a theologian, and not a mere philosopher like Spinoza. I have to shake my head every time I think about these things. Kant did some of the same stuff in 1785 during the pantheism controversy to cleanse himself of suspicions of Spinozism, if you will. And Leibniz didn't exactly embrace his mentor. But I digress. Spinoza is a hero among students of philosophy today because he followed Socrates, our patron saint, in striving to follow the truth wherever and whenever it leads. Sometimes it would lead to heresy, and Spinoza would say as much in terms that were direct, provocative, and guaranteed to make him a marked man throughout his lifetime and beyond. That, my friends, is a radical. Arthur Green, and I mean this, is a great man. He's a great rabbi and a good man. He's probably a great man and a great rabbi. But he is no radical. For years, his same approach has been employed in progressive synagogues all over the United States. And that approach is far from Orthodox Judaism, to be sure. But then again, most Jews are not Orthodox. What Green and his fellow mainstream progressive clerics deliver is an alternative to orthodoxy that seeks to avoid its most obviously antiquated feature, the idea that the world as we know it is the product of an omnibenevolent, omnipotent deity who acts in accordance with a merciful, just, and ultimately inscrutable will. Fine. But what these clerics don't do is explain the alternative as clearly and coherently as did Spinoza, or as did Green in one portion of his writings, right? For if they did, they would have to confront the issue of whether many of the traditional Jewish teachings and prayers are better off being attacked as false than reinterpreted as deeper truths. That's what true heretics or radicals do. They slay sacred cows. Arthur Green is more of a pragmatist. He would rather identify whatever beauty can be found in cow worshiping and suggest how it can be harmonized with God worshiping by changing the meaning of the rituals and prayers. And what we are left with is nice poetry, but incoherent philosophy when it is examined in the light of the statements that we have considered. So let me defend that thesis. In the introduction to Seek My Face, Green reveals his intentions to find a balance between tradition and truth. It is the same balance that Jewish thinkers have sought since the time of Maimonides, who wrote that tradition was for, quote, women, children, and common people, unquote, who can't comprehend the truth, he went on to say. They're incapable, so we give them tradition. Green said that he will be searching for truth, while at the same time, and I quote, turning to the wisdom and language of religious tradition, which is shrouded in mystery and awe. Ultimately, we will seek a bargain between the tradition and the seeker. I will enter into biblical language not as a literal believer, but rather as one who recognizes that all these biblical events are themselves metaphors for a truth whose depth reaches far beyond them, unquote. And we have seen one result of this bargain. Green has grounded his metaphysics in Spinozic panentheism, Spinozistic, I should say, panentheism. But when it comes time to apply the lessons from Jewish tradition, Green largely undermines the thrust of that philosophy. And this begins by refusing to follow Spinoza's lead in ridiculing the practice of humanizing God. All Spinozists love this line. A triangle, if it could speak, would likewise say that God is eminently triangular, and a circle, that God's nature is eminently circular. One of Spinoza's best. By contrast, Green states sympathetically that, quote, we cannot live with a faceless God. For us, God needs to have a human face. How human? Consider that this so-called post-Holocaust Jew, in connection with praising the language of love, his line, the language of love, reminds us of the, quote, great single love of God that animates the cosmos, unquote. Green goes on to explain that, quote, compassion is divine, unquote. For, quote, it is the presence of Adonai within us that causes us to give, to love generously, and to care, unquote. And then Green cites with sympathy the teaching that, quote, the compassionate one, and one is capitalized, the compassionate one desires the heart. Yes, this is the same guy who wrote those things and is writing these things. Note that when Green makes such proclamations about God's inherently loving nature, he refrains from clarifying whether he is talking about God as an active, indivisible power or God as the sum of worldly forms. Unlike Spinoza, who routinely announces which perspective on God he is speaking about. Green just conflates the two. Thus, we are left to guess for ourselves whether he is talking about natura naturans or natura naturata when he speaks of God as, quote, the eternal source of inner light. As the one calls us into being, so does it cry out from within us to seek out its light in others, to brighten the light that glows within ourselves, and to draw others to that light, unquote. As a Spinozist, I have to ask, is that what happened during the Holocaust? Is that what is happening in the Middle East, or for that matter, on Capitol Hill? In other words, should God really be associated more with the light than the darkness? Aren't they both part of the one and only? Green, the metaphysician, might agree with Spinoza. But Green, the theologian, is offering us a metaphysics that is as warm and uplifting as Spinoza's is cold and hard-headed. Green's uplifting message continues with the central role that he assigns to the concept of evolution. Despite the existence of black holes and stars growing nova, Green teaches that evolution is the greatest of all religious dramas. To Green, the force of God strives, quote, relentlessly, though by no means perfectly, toward greater complexity and consciousness, unquote. And he suggests that this is, quote, a new narrative of creation that we should be able to embrace today. What Green has done is simply shelve the old metaphors about a foreboding God above and replace them with a softer God who reigns deep within our bodies and souls. To quote Green again, "The God who speaks in thunder is still the one who dwells in heaven and atop the highest peak. We are seeking a more fully internalized version of that foot of the mountain experience," unquote. Though benevolent, Green's internalized God is limited in power to beatify the earth. He requires a partner, and yes, that's where we come in this narrative. We exist to supply the added compassion and energy that is necessary to recreate Eden throughout the world. And this is what Green means by saying that, quote, religion is the human fulfillment of the divine will or purpose. As you can see, Green has simply replaced one cosmic narrative with another, and has done so by utilizing virtually the full panoply of Jewish metaphors. This is my Rachel Maddow imitation. I'm going to list them, but just not for an hour. At different points, he provides sympathetic, though reconstructed interpretations of the concept of the creation story, the Messiah, Revelation, Eden, miracles, Tzimtzum, the contraction of God, self-contraction of God, I should say, the Akia, God calling out, where are you? God is Father, God is King, and the idea, a personal disfavorite of mine, the idea of human beings as the images of God. Green has the opportunity to criticize these ideas, but in each case he embraces them, and he is not alone. Rabbis from Reconstructionist, Jewish Renewal, and Reform synagogues frequently employ the same approach. Reinterpret, don't reject. Far from being radical Judaism, I'd prefer to call it Will Rogers Judaism. These clerics have virtually never met a traditional Jewish word or phrase that they didn't like, though they reserve the right to change the meaning however they see fit. But there is, of course, one Jewish concept they won't reconstruct. The bugaboo of every progressive Jew, the concept that Jews are God's chosen people. That one is unsafe at any speed. So, the next and the final lengthy part of this talk is called Giving the Philosophers and the Theologians Their Due and No More. And I want to start with a quote that I just adore. It's from Ken Wilber, who wrote that we must, quote, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, to Einstein what is Einstein's, to Picasso what is Picasso's, to Kant what is Kant's, and to Christ what is Christ's. That, to me, is a nice way of saying that Green was right, that the critical decisions invariably involve bargains. and we always need to be balanced. We always need to recognize that when we devote our heart and mind exclusively to one discipline, whether it's economics, theology, or yes, philosophy, we will have missed the boat. Just as no person or movement should have a monopoly on the meaning of God, no discipline should have a monopoly on our approach to enlightenment. Religion and philosophy both have their proper place. Green's failure, in my view, doesn't come from the fact that he was striking a bargain with philosophy, but from the manner in which he struck it. He appreciates that at a time after Voltaire, Darwin, and Hitler, biblical literalism will fail to speak to many of us, for we have proclaimed ourselves rationalists, and we have rationally observed our connections both to monkeys and to madmen. Nevertheless, the metaphorical interpretations that Green has substituted for biblical literalism don't exactly reflect a willingness to give philosophy the full respect it deserves. When you combine Green the philosopher, that's hyphenated, with Green the theologian, what you get is an incoherent mishmash, rationalist one moment, Pollyannish the next. And as we've seen, when he's not referring to the conventional religious viewpoint as blasphemous, he's adopting so many conventional religious concepts that he can theologically embrace nearly all the traditional Jewish prayers. What is he saying? The truth seeker in me doesn't believe that Green has allotted philosophy its proper place. We need philosophy in order to harmonize our thoughts and feelings as much as possible with our highest vision of the truth. Philosophy impels us to be courageous in opening our eyes to that vision, and rigorous in our devotion to what that vision entails. It asks us to strive to be logical, consistent, and self-critical. And with respect to these points, there is never a legitimate reason to make a compromise. But that hardly makes philosophy all-powerful. It need not, for example, restrict our ability to live emotionally, physically, socially, and spiritually rich lives. It need not. It is easy to criticize Green from the standpoint of logical consistency. And yet the fundamental task of a philosopher who reads Green is not to do what I have done so far, to point out his limitations and mistakes, but rather to find the beauty in what he has said. In my view, Green has written much that we can use to build on Spinoza's relatively pure, and I say that as an insult, pure, consistent, and hard-headed approach to panentheism. Consider that Spinoza gives us an ethic centered on neurobiology, in which all of our actions are necessarily founded on selfishness, for neurons are selfish. Green, for his part, gives us a valuable complement, a heart-based ethic based on compassion. From an ethical standpoint, if not a metaphysical one, can we really say too much about the importance of compassion? I don't think so. Does a balanced philosophy not require us to appreciate that if reason must be our keel in life, empathy should be our rudder? And speaking of compassion or love, Spinoza taught that what is central to our blessedness is our ability to intellectually love God. But as Green reminds us, optimal spirituality requires not merely intellectual love, but also awe. Even though Spinoza never emphasized that emotion, there is nothing in his philosophy that compels us to neglect its value. Nothing. In fact, I might even argue that our capacity for awe is more heightened when it comes to Spinoza's conception of God than Green's counterpart. Green would have us revere the interior of the world, which he implies is more divine than the world of our senses. But to Spinoza, we don't live in a realm of levels of reality in which God is associated primarily with the unknowable abyss. Instead, we associate Spinoza's God equally with every earthly form we encounter, every thought, every physical object. And we would be wise to realize that all such forms are exactly as they must be, unique expressions of a God whose power extends infinitely in every direction we can imagine and an infinite number that we can't. Why wouldn't such a God be worthy of our awe? And if we are capable of the emotion of gratitude, why wouldn't such a God be worthy of our worship as well? Of course, there are those who would say, worship would not be an appropriate response to a non-human-like God. But I would say to them that they are inappropriately narrowing what we mean by worship, just as the monopolists have inappropriately narrowed what we should mean by God. Green has much to say about the magical power of that word, God. And on that point, I personally cannot agree with him more. Part of the power of the word God is that it easily lends itself to becoming a name. And as such, it truly does call out to be encountered, not merely studied. This was an idea that was never explicated in Spinoza, not clearly at least. And while there are many who believe that Spinoza in his personal life may well have been a mystical panentheist, just as Green calls himself, Spinoza was hardly clear about his devotion to mystical practices. Philosophers shouldn't fear those practices. In fact, the contemplation to which they lead can fulfill us intellectually as well as emotionally. Perhaps most importantly, Green's teaching serves as a reminder that the whole notion of personal enlightenment should not be our sole goal in life, though it would be easy to forget that point if you only read Spinoza's Ethics and other philosophy books. Remember what Marx said. He was a real radical, just like Spinoza. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Green, who recognizes the fundamental religious importance of the deed, even above that of knowledge, has demonstrated his commitment to making the world whole through, among other things, his environmentalism, vegetarianism, universalism, pacifism, and commitment to economic equity. If he had distinguished as religiously as did Spinoza between God as natura naturans and God as natura naturata, Green could have built on his predecessor's teachings to show that while human efforts to transform our planet may be of no moment to God from the standpoint of substance or naturans, they are vitally important from the standpoint of naturata, or the world. As Green's teacher Heschel might say, when we look at God through the world of, God, of the divine infinite expressions, human beings are truly a divine need, a point that Spinoza never made. So remember, philosophy has its proper place, but so too do our theologians' efforts to lift up the world rather than simply contemplate and discuss it. But you didn't really think I would end on an uplifting note, did you? Otherwise, I would have never gone to law school. Okay. For me, the real tragedy of progressive theologians like Green is not that they have little to offer us that philosophers haven't already provided. They have a whole wealth of spiritual gifts in their bag. The problem is that by failing to recognize the proper place of philosophy as the vital keel to the vessels on which we travel throughout this life. These theologians have become irrelevant as theologians to the vast majority of educated human beings. No, most educated human beings are not philosophers. They're not even students of philosophy. But they do live in a post-Enlightenment world. And they do recognize philosophical mishmash and evasion when they see it. I try to imagine most people I know reading Green's statements about the inner gate of God, the higher inscrutable unity in which the power of both Heschel and Hitler reside, and which acts out of necessity rather than free will. And then I imagine these contemporary readers noticing Green's comments about how we are made in God's compassionate image and have been put on earth to fulfill the divine will or purpose. And I suspect that these readers would be struck by the incoherence of the message. We cannot expect them to believe in such a conception of God if it is stocked with internal inconsistencies. But tragically, Green is hardly alone as a cleric in trying to have his cake and eat it too when it comes to grappling with the divine. As a result, it is hardly surprising that I so often hear members of progressive synagogues admit that while they don't believe in God or see themselves as religious, they attend shul for cultural reasons and because they like being part of a community that has shared, values, social values. From my standpoint as a committed or devout panentheist, the tragedy is that without a solid, coherent philosophy as its foundation, progressive Judaism has lost its proper place as a vehicle to help people connect with God. And this is why for all of Green's work and all of the teachings of the other neo-Hasids, panentheism remains a fringe theology. Who knows? It might actually grow in popularity if Green and others were willing to embrace that core philosophy that they have set. In other words, the Spinozism, rather than hide from it. Green has demonstrated that a person can be a theologian without embracing all of the traditional prayers and concepts. After all, he doesn't do gymnastics to adopt the notion of Jewish chosenness. He knows how to blow hot, but he also knows how to blow cold. And that's really all a philosopher can ask of the theological community. That, and to have the courage to blow cold more often in the name of logical consistency, clarity, and truth. I'm almost done. As for Green's penchant for redefining terms, I cannot find fault with that. Spinoza redefined terms. In fact, the whole panentheist project rests on the decision to redefine a term, at least to a degree. The issue is not his willingness to redefine, but the lack of willingness to stop redefining and start attacking when appropriate. And this is for all of those who think Spinoza should have been excommunicated even today, who think that Spinoza is not a Jew. Spinoza understood that truth. And that is one reason why, just as Goethe called him Christianissimum, the most Christian, I would argue that Spinoza is among the most Jewish. To be sure, Spinoza was no Moses, for he was not devoted to the Torah as our people's eternal law. Yet Spinoza does resemble Moses' patriarch, who we know today as Abraham. After all, both Abraham and Spinoza were Jews, men of God, men of truth, men of courage, men of conviction, slayers of sacred cows, and ultimately, fathers of religious philosophies that have stood the test of time. It will be up to rabbis who follow Green to give Spinoza's religious philosophy its proper place as an honored alternative in the spiritual marketplace of ideas. And it will be up to philosophers who study Spinoza to give Green's theology its proper place as a helpful supplement to the overly intellectualized geometrical proofs and hard-hearted conclusions in Spinoza's majestic ethics. So let me conclude with the words of a wise woman who sadly is venerated neither as a philosopher nor as a theologian, but who is nevertheless beloved. There are those who claim she isn't real. But then again, you often hear the same thing about God, and no pantheist can take that seriously either. The sage to whom I refer is the great Wilma Flintstone. Wilma once repeated the old saw, men, can't live with them, can't live without them. Well, the same thing could surely be said for theologians. It's up to us students of philosophy to find the best ones, learn from them, love them, and yet hold their feet to the fire when necessary. Knowing what we know about Wilma and her husband, I'm sure she understood those points all too well. I will take your questions. Okay.
Dan, I have to credit your talk with giving me an appreciation for Rabbi Greek, rather than sharing your conclusions about him. At one point you said that this has no appeal to educated human beings. That seems to me the beginning of a piece of.
I'm going to cut you off only for a moment because that misstates what I said. I did not say that no educated human beings are traditionally religious. So let's not misstate it.
Well, what did you say?
And also, this is a Q&A, so yeah. I said that there are many educated human beings alive today who have lost their appreciation